It was the last class of the day. The rain outside tapped against the windows like a ticking clock, and in room 204, Mr. Hargrove was bored. He scanned the rows of tired faces until his gaze landed on Owen, the quiet boy in the back. Thin. Pale. Always looking out the window, as if searching for a better world beyond algebra. Mr. Hargrove smirked. "Mr. Carter," he said loudly, making the whole class turn, "why don't you come up here and solve something special?" Owen looked up, startled. His ears turned red, but he stood. He always did what he was told. His sneakers squeaked as he walked to the board. The teacher scribbled a monstrous equation, the chalk screeching painfully. Owen stared at it. Whispers filled the room. "This should be good," someone muttered. Mr. Hargrove crossed his arms, leaning back like a man watching a fly struggle in a web. "Take your time," he said with mock kindness. What no one knew, not the students, not even Owen's parents, was that Owen had an IQ of 172. Numbers didn't scare him. People did. But in his mind, the equation unfolded like a puzzle made of silk. Every part slid into place effortlessly. While the class snickered behind him, Owen picked up the chalk. First, he eliminated the denominator. Then, he balanced both sides. Factored. Simplified. Solved. His hands moved with quiet confidence, as if writing a secret only he understood. The room fell silent. The whispers died. Owen stepped back. The final answer shone on the board, flawless. Mr. Hargrove blinked, his smirk twitching into something uncertain. He checked the work, his face reddening as he realized. Owen was right. Perfectly, devastatingly right. Owen turned around, his eyes scanning the faces of his classmates. For once, no one laughed. No one whispered. And for the first time in his life, Owen allowed himself the smallest smile. As he walked back to his seat, Mr. Hargrove cleared his throat. "Well done," he muttered, almost choking on the words. But Owen didn't need the praise. For the first time, he had shown them all exactly who he was. And it felt like freedom. The final bell rang. Chairs scraped the floor, and backpacks zipped shut, but no one left right away. They just stared. Owen felt the weight of every pair of eyes on him as he slid his notebook into his bag. His heart pounded, but it wasn't fear this time. It was something sharper. Louder. Power. "Hey, Owen," a voice called softly. It was Mia. The girl who never once looked his way in 2 years. Now, her voice trembled like she was speaking to someone different. Someone important. "How did you even do that?" Owen shrugged, trying to play it off, though his pulse was wild. It wasn't that hard. And it wasn't. Not for him. But as he looked back toward the front of the room, he saw Mr. Hargrove still standing by the board, staring at the answer like it might attack him. For years, Mr. Hargrove had picked on kids like Owen. The quiet ones. The different ones. The ones who didn't fight back. Maybe it made him feel bigger. Smarter. More in control. But not today. Today, Owen shattered whatever twisted game the man had been playing. And for the first time, Owen saw something in the teacher's eyes he'd never seen before. Fear. The class shuffled out, but Owen took his time, enjoying the silence that followed him like a crown. As he passed Mr. Hargrove, he paused just for a second, enough to glance up at him. "Thanks for the challenge," Owen said, his voice smooth as glass. "Let me know if you've got anything harder." The man opened his mouth to reply but said nothing. What could he say? Owen left the room, the hallway waiting for him like a kingdom. And for once, the world didn't feel so heavy on his shoulders. Maybe, just maybe, being different wasn't a curse. Maybe it was his greatest weapon. And he was just getting started. By Monday, everyone at school knew. Owen Carter, the invisible kid from the back row, had humiliated Mr. Hargrove in front of the entire class. They whispered about him in the hallways now. Not in the cruel way they used to. This was different. Respect. Curiosity. Fear. But not everyone liked the new version of Owen. Especially not Mr. Hargrove. By Thursday, the teacher had a plan. Pop quiz, Hargrove announced, slapping a stack of papers onto his desk with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. 50 minutes. No calculators. When Owen flipped the paper over, his heart skipped. These weren't normal problems. These were college-level questions. Stuff meant to crush him. He glanced up. And Hargrove was watching him. Only him. The message was clear, I'm still in charge. But Owen felt something strange inside. A fire, slow and steady. For years, he'd been shrinking himself, folding his mind into small, safe shapes so no one would notice. Not anymore. He picked up his pen. And for the next 50 minutes, the classroom faded away. Time didn't exist. There was only the math, unfolding in his head like music, like art, like breathing. When the bell rang, Owen placed his quiz on Hargrove's desk without a word. That night, Hargrove stayed late grading. Page after page of perfect work. Correct answers. Elegant solutions. It wasn't possible. Hargrove felt his throat tighten. If the boy was smarter than him, what did that make him? The next day, he called Owen to stay after class. The room emptied, leaving just the two of them in the stale air. You think you're clever, Hargrove said quietly, leaning over his desk. But people like you burn out. Sooner or later, you'll fail. Owen looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the truth. This man wasn't angry. He was scared. And it wasn't about Owen anymore. It was about the version of himself that Hargrove could never be. Owen slung his bag over his shoulder and smiled, calm and unbothered. Maybe. But not today. And he walked out, leaving the man behind like an old shadow. Because Owen finally understood. Being a genius wasn't about impressing anyone. It wasn't about revenge. It was about freedom. And this? This was only the beginning. Weeks passed. Owen kept winning. Every test. Every challenge. Every problem Mr. Hargrove threw at him, desperate to prove the first time had been luck. But it wasn't luck. It was just Owen. And now, others were starting to notice. One afternoon, as Owen packed his bag, a woman in a navy blazer stepped into the classroom. She was sharp, polished, and her briefcase looked more expensive than Mr. Hargrove's entire car. "Mr. Carter?" she asked. Owen blinked. Yeah?" She smiled like she already knew the answer to every question he'd ever ask. "I'm from the State Academic Board. We've been hearing about your talent. There's a national mathematics competition in 3 months. Full scholarship opportunities. Invitations to top universities. I'd love to see your name on the roster." The whole class froze. Mia, sitting 2 rows over, gave him a look like, "Who even are you?" Mr. Hargrove's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, probably to say something to make himself feel relevant. But the woman was already handing Owen her card, like he was the only person in the room worth speaking to. "We'll be in touch," she said, nodding. Then she left as quickly as she came. Silence. Until someone whispered, "Dude, what the hell?" And for the first time, Owen didn't feel small. He didn't feel invisible. He felt inevitable. The competition. 3 months later, Owen stood on a stage in a massive auditorium under blinding lights. Cameras pointed at him. Judges whispered behind their clipboards. The problems they gave him looked impossible to anyone else. But Owen didn't even flinch. And when they announced his name as the winner, the youngest champion in the competition's history, his whole world shifted. Offers flooded in. Scholarships. Internships. Universities fighting over him. And back home? Mr. Hargrove watched it all on TV. Alone. Owen never went back to room 204. Not really. He moved on to bigger things, brighter futures. But sometimes, when he passed by the school, he thought about that rainy afternoon. The moment a bitter man tried to make him small. And accidentally set him free. 10 years later. The sky over the city glowed gold, the skyline cut sharp against the setting sun. Owen Carter stepped out of the sleek black car, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit. The logo on the building above him read Carter Innovations. World-renowned. Billion-dollar contracts. Nobel Prize rumored to be on the horizon. And all of it had started with a single equation on a chalkboard. He didn't think about the past much anymore. But today? Today was different. There was an event being hosted at his old high school. Some charity fundraiser. The principal had begged him to come back and inspire the next generation. Owen figured, why not? He entered the familiar hallway. The lockers were smaller than he remembered. The air still smelled faintly of dust and old books. And that's when he saw him. Mr. Hargrove. Older now. Grayer. Still wearing the same tired blazer. He was stacking chairs, like some janitor forgotten in the background of a school that had moved on without him. Their eyes met. For a second, Hargrove froze, like he wasn't sure if Owen was real. "Owen," he managed, voice rough. I've seen you on the news. Quite the career you've built." Owen smiled politely, the way you do when someone's already irrelevant. "Thanks," he said simply. There was a pause. Then, Hargrove, the same man who once tried to humiliate him for fun, cleared his throat. "Listen, if there were any opportunities. At your company, I mean. I'd be grateful to." Owen didn't laugh. He wasn't cruel. But he let the silence do the work for him. "I'm afraid we're looking for innovators," Owen said, almost kindly. "People who lift others up. Not tear them down." Hargrove's face fell. Just slightly. Just enough. Owen nodded once. "Well. Good luck with the chairs." And with that, he walked into the auditorium, where hundreds of students were waiting to hear how a quiet kid from the back of the class had changed the world. Tonight, Owen would tell them the truth. That brilliance isn't about being better than anyone else. It's about refusing to let small people keep you small. And most of all, it's about solving the equation no one thinks you can. And making sure they never forget who did. The applause filled the auditorium like a wave crashing on the shore. Owen stood on the stage, the spotlight warm on his face, scanning the sea of students who looked at him the way he used to look at the people he admired. Hopeful. Hungry. Ready. He told his story. Not just the successes, but the nights alone solving problems for no one but himself. The years spent being overlooked, underestimated. The teacher who thought humiliating him would keep him small. They hung on every word. And then, near the end, Owen paused. I used to believe being smart meant staying quiet, he said, his voice steady. But the truth is, there will always be people who feel threatened by your potential. People who want to keep you in the back row, afraid to raise your hand. People who only feel tall when they're standing on top of someone else. A ripple of silence moved through the crowd. Owen glanced to the side of the stage. Hargrove was there, leaning against the wall, half hidden in the dark, watching. For the first time, Owen wasn't looking up at him. He was looking down. And when that happens, Owen continued, turning back to the students, you don't dim yourself to make them comfortable. You shine so bright they can't stand it. The room erupted. Standing ovation. Cheering. And Owen? He just smiled. Not out of revenge. Not anymore. It wasn't about Hargrove. It never really was. It was about the kid in the back row, in any classroom anywhere in the world, sitting there right now thinking they're invisible. They weren't. And neither was he. As the crowd started to settle, Owen gave them the final line. The one he wished someone had told him all those years ago. Remember, sometimes the hardest equation you'll ever solve is believing in yourself. But once you do, there's not a problem in the world you can't conquer. Mic drop. The lights dimmed. The night moved on. And Mr. Hargrove? He slipped out quietly, unnoticed this time. While Owen Carter's name echoed through the building, the streets, the city. And soon, the world. 15 years later. Owen Carter wasn't just a name anymore. He was a movement. From revolutionary tech that powered cities to programs that gave scholarships to kids who reminded him of himself, Owen had become something bigger than fame. He was change. Magazine covers. Fortune 100 lists. Invitations from presidents, prime ministers, kings. But none of it ever distracted him from the mission, finding the quiet geniuses of the world and making sure they never sat invisible in the back row again. One evening, at a massive global education summit in New York, Owen stood backstage, reviewing his speech. Nothing fancy. Just the usual, inspire a few thousand people, change some lives. Another Tuesday. But then his assistant walked over, hesitant. Mr. Carter? There's someone here requesting to speak with you. Says he used to be your teacher. Owen didn't even need to ask. He already knew. Send him in, Owen said, barely looking up. And there he was. Mr. Hargrove. Older. Smaller. Life had worn him down in all the ways arrogance eventually does. A man who once thought a chalkboard was his throne now stood awkwardly in the corner of a dressing room that wasn't built for people like him. Owen set his notes down, leaned back, and studied him for a long moment. Funny how time works. Hargrove cleared his throat. I came to say congratulations, he managed, eyes darting around like the floor might save him. I always knew you'd do well. Lie. Owen tilted his head. Did you? Silence. And then Hargrove sighed, his shoulders sagging under invisible weight. Truth is, I was hard on you because I saw you were different. And I guess I resented that. You were everything I wasn't. There it was. The confession. The admission every part of Owen once craved. But now? It felt small. Irrelevant. Like an equation he'd already solved long ago. Owen stood, straightened his jacket, and grabbed his speech. "Thanks for saying that," he said simply, without bitterness. Without gloating. Just peace. And as he walked past Hargrove, he paused and added, "There's a seat reserved for you tonight. Front row. Thought you might finally want a better view." And then Owen left him there. Because true victory isn't about revenge. It's about rising so high that even the people who tried to bury you have no choice but to look up and applaud. The auditorium was packed. Cameras flashed. The world watched as Owen Carter took the stage, standing beneath a giant screen displaying the words, "The future of genius." But as he stood there, preparing to deliver the most important speech of his career, his eyes drifted toward the front row. And there was Mr. Hargrove. Older. Quieter. A man who once controlled Owen's world, now sitting silently in a sea of people who came to listen to him. For just a second, their eyes met. And in that second, something unexpected passed between them. Not hatred. Not revenge. Just understanding. Because Owen realized that without Mr. Hargrove's cruelty, without that challenge scrawled on the chalkboard all those years ago, maybe he never would have become the man he was standing here today. Maybe the person who tried to break him accidentally lit the fire that changed the world. And so, Owen adjusted the microphone. Tonight, he began, his voice calm, powerful, steady. I want to dedicate this to every kid who was told they weren't good enough. Who was underestimated, ignored, or made to feel small. And to the people who doubted us. Thank you. Because you taught us exactly who we never wanted to become. And exactly how high we were meant to rise. The crowd exploded. Standing ovation. Thunderous applause. But Mr. Hargrove didn't clap. He just watched. And for the first time, he was the invisible one. Owen turned, smiled at the thousands of faces looking up at him, and finished with the words that sealed his legacy forever. In the end, it was never about proving them wrong. It was about proving to ourselves that we were right all along. The lights dimmed. The screen faded to black. And in that silence, the world finally understood. Some equations change grades. But others? They change everything. Months passed after the summit. Owen's speech went viral. Not just online, but everywhere. It played in classrooms around the world. On TV. In documentaries. And soon, something incredible started happening. Messages poured in. From kids in small towns. From students who thought they'd never matter. From the quiet ones in the back row who finally realized they weren't broken, they were brilliant. And Owen didn't stop at words. He built the Equation Initiative, a global foundation designed to find and fund the overlooked geniuses of the world. The misfits. The underdogs. The ones people like Mr. Hargrove ignored or mocked into silence. And suddenly, Owen wasn't the only one rising. Thousands of them were. Kids from forgotten neighborhoods winning international awards. Young inventors filing patents before they graduated high school. A new generation of minds that refused to be told they were too much or not enough. 1 year later, Owen sat in his office, high above the city skyline. The world outside glowed with the lights of endless possibility, but his attention was on an envelope that had arrived on his desk. Old school. Handwritten. From Mr. Hargrove. Owen opened it carefully, expecting, well, he didn't know what to expect. Inside was a single piece of paper. The handwriting was shaky. I used to think the smartest person in the room was the one with all the answers. You showed me it's the one who helps others find theirs. I was wrong about you. About a lot of things. Thank you for proving me wrong. No return address. Just closure. Real, honest closure. And Owen didn't frame the letter. Didn't show it off. He folded it once, tucked it in the back of his notebook, the same notebook he used to scribble equations in as a kid, and smiled. Because at the end of the day, the real equation was never about solving for X. It was about solving for yourself. And Owen had finally found his answer. Years later, Owen Carter's name had become something bigger than the man himself. It wasn't just on the buildings he funded or the schools he rebuilt. It was whispered like folklore in classrooms. Did you hear about Owen Carter? The kid who outsmarted his teacher and changed the world? No way, that's just a story. It's real. Look him up. And in some forgotten corner of some small classroom, another kid, sitting quietly in the back row, would hear the legend. The teacher droning on. The students not paying attention. And that kid? They'd open a notebook and start to write. Not because anyone expected them to. Not because anyone believed in them. But because now they knew. They could. And as for Owen? He never stopped. He left the companies to trusted people. Handed over the board seats. Walked away from the cameras. And spent the rest of his life traveling the world, walking into the schools no one cared about. Sitting in the last row next to the quietest kid. Sliding a fresh notebook across the desk and whispering. Write it down. Solve the impossible. Then go show them who you are. And if you looked closely at the cover of that notebook, stamped on the front, in small gold letters, was just one word. Begin. Years later, a classroom somewhere in the world. The world had changed. Owen Carter was no longer just a name. He was a legacy. In a humble classroom, the hum of a teacher's voice drifted through the air. Children sat at their desks, faces half hidden behind textbooks, eyes glazed with the day's lesson. Another typical morning. Another day of silence in the back row. But in that back row, something was different. A young boy sat, scribbling furiously in a notebook, his fingers stained with ink. His eyes shone with a quiet determination. He wasn't the loudest in class. He didn't ask for attention. But he didn't need it. Because he knew there was a brilliance inside him waiting to break free. His teacher droned on. His classmates did not notice him. But his mind? It soared. His hand moved across the paper, solving the equations in ways no one expected. And when the bell rang and his classmates left for the day, he stayed. Alone, in the silence of the empty room. He finished the equation that had been haunting him for weeks. One that no one else seemed to understand. It wasn't just math. It was more than that. It was something bigger. A problem that had been waiting for someone to solve it. As the boy packed his bag, he reached into the bottom of his desk and pulled out something unexpected, an old notebook. It was a tattered, worn thing, the edges frayed, but on the cover, there was a single word stamped in gold letters. Begin. Inside, there were pages filled with equations, sketches, thoughts, and ideas. All written by someone who once sat where he was sitting now. Someone who had walked the path he was about to walk. The name at the top of the page was Owen Carter. The boy turned the pages, absorbing each word, each line of scribbled genius. He read about how Owen Carter once sat in a back row, invisible to everyone, underestimated by the world. He read how Owen solved the impossible equations that everyone else had written off, how he rose above the voices that told him he wasn't enough. And then, on the final page of the notebook, he found a note, just like the ones Owen had written to himself when he was a kid. It said, "Solve what they say you can't. Find what they say is impossible. Then go show them who you are. Because you are the answer." The boy closed the notebook. And for the first time, he didn't feel small. He didn't feel invisible. He felt invincible. He left the classroom that day, the notebook in his hand, and the weight of destiny on his shoulders. He knew what he had to do. The road would be hard. The world would doubt him, mock him, challenge him at every turn. But he would not be stopped. He was part of something much bigger now. A new generation of thinkers, dreamers, and doers. A generation built on the shoulders of someone who had once been overlooked and underestimated. And so, as the boy walked into the world with his head held high, the words from Owen's notebook echoed in his mind. Solve the impossible. Show them who you are. And the world would never be the same again.